Hey, what's up YouTube? This is my wife's 2012 Kia Optima. The starter went out on it a while back and I had to replace it in AutoZone parking lot, and I really couldn't find a lot of videos on how to do it. And the videos that I did find showed that you had to completely remove the intake off the vehicle. So I've got a new starter on here, but I'm going to go ahead and make a video on how to replace it. Hopefully it'll help some other people. And I'm going to show you the absolute easiest way to replace a starter without removing the intake. This is an easy job. You can do it with just simple tools, and really anybody should be able to do this in an hour, hour and a half max. Like I said, I did it in AutoZone parking lot, and it took me about an hour. So it's not a super hard job, but there are a few tricks that this video will hopefully help you with. Hey, if this video helps you out, one thing you can do to repay me is hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and add a comment. All of those things help drive the analytics for YouTube, so that it increases the popularity of my videos. I appreciate you guys watching. Let's get to it. Okay, here's the tools you're going to need for this job. I've got a 1/4 and a 3/8 inch ratchet. I've got a 10, 12, and 13 millimeter 1/4 inch drive plus a little small extension. I've got a 12 millimeter and 14 millimeter 3/8 drive and a long extension. You may need a screwdriver to help pry the hoses loose, a pair of needle nose pliers, a regular pair of pliers, and then once you get done, you're going to need some antifreeze to reap. So the first thing you're going to do is take this part of the intake off. It's just two 10 millimeter bolts right here on the front. You pull those two bolts out and this piece comes right out of the vehicle. That's all there is to that. I always recommend putting your bolts back in the holes they came out of. Just thread them a couple turns in there, and that way when you're putting everything back together, you don't have to wonder what goes in what hole. The next step here, you can just pull this cover off the top of the engine. It's easy, it just pops off and it gets it out of the way. So you just pop that off and pull it right out of the way. The next step here is to get the rest of this intake out of the way. We're going to need to get down into there where the throttle body is to access the bolts on the back side of the starter. And so to take this throttle body, or not the throttle body, to take this intake loose, there is down in there, there's a band. So you just loosen that band and that will come loose right there. There's one hose connected right here that you're going to have to take loose, and then on the back side right here, just take this band loose and then it'll just rotate right up out of the way. Okay, I got that air hose, that air intake taken out of the way. I just pulled it loose and laid it back there. It's got some hoses attached to the back side of it. They don't need to come off. And then the next step is going to be to remove this upper radiator hose. You're going to lose a little bit of coolant here, so you're going to have to put some coolant back in the vehicle. But removing this hose, and then here in a minute I'll show you removing the fan, gives you a lot more room, and it gives you the ability to do this without taking that intake off. So to take this off, to take this upper radiator hose off, it's one 10 millimeter bolt right here. You've got a squeeze clamp right here on the end. You're going to pull it loose, and you got a squeeze clamp back there on the back. That's going to come loose, and like I said, you're going to lose a little bit of coolant, but that will get this out of the way. Be careful when you take this clamp loose and you pull this off that you don't run a bunch of coolant down inside of your throttle body, because pulled that intake off, now that throttle body is open, so you may want to cover it with something when you pull that back hose off, or at least be very careful so that you don't dump a bunch of radiator fluid down inside your throttle body. Okay, now that the upper radiator hose is out of the way, you're going to take this fan out of the way. That sounds difficult, but really there's two bolts holding this thing on and a plug. The two bolts, I'm going to try and show you where they're at, but there's one right there, and there's another one over here on this side, and you'll be able to see them, but it's right underneath. It's right underneath here. There's a bolt right there. Once you get those two bolts out, the fan will kind of rotate forward, and then you can wiggle it out of there, and that's going to give you a ton of room to work on the rest of this. And again, it's just two bolts. All right, once those 2 bolts are out, then the fan, if you pull up on it, it'll come out of a bracket at the bottom, and then it's just a matter of kind of wedging it up and out of here. You got to take the back side of the plug off right there. And it takes a little finagling to get the fan out of here. But if you just work at it, it'll come right out. All right, the next step once you get your fan out is to take this throttle body loose, and it's just 4 10mm bolts. You don't have to disconnect any of the hoses or anything. These are some coolant lines and things that are connected to the throttle body. We've just got to get it far enough out of the way to get to those 2 bolts that hold the starter on. So don't disconnect those hoses. And that gets your throttle body out of the way. All right, if you need to, you can disconnect this plug on the throttle body right here, and that'll allow it to get further out of your way. The next thing to do is to take the intake loose. We're not going to take the intake off, which would require us to disconnect all of these plugs and all of the hoses and stuff to it. All we're going to do is just take it loose so that we can move it up enough that that starter will fall out from the bottom. So to do that, there's 5 nuts that you've got to take off. There's one down here on the outside, 2 right up here across the top, a 4th on the outside over here on this side, and then there's a hole right down through the intake right here where there is a nut holding it on there, or actually I think that one's a bolt. So you got to pull your oil dipstick out of the way to get to the 1, and then these are 12mm nuts. All right, that's got the top of the intake taken loose. So now you need to take the bottom of the intake loose. And this is a little hard to demonstrate, but if you go straight down this second rib, so there's 4 ribs across here. The second one from the right, if you kind of run your hand right down underneath it, you're going to feel the head of a bolt. And that is a 12mm bolt right there. So you're going to have to take that bolt loose, and then if you reach to the left of that, almost down this next rib right here, kind of the outside of it, this is the second from the right, or second from the left rib. Run your hand down underneath it, you'll feel the head of the other bolt. Those 2 bolts have to come loose. Those are 12mm, and you can get them with just a ratchet and a 12mm socket. Those have got to come loose. That's going to let the bottom of the intake come up enough so that the starter comes out. All right, the next thing to do is to get this throttle body out of the way, and I'm going to show you where the 2 bolts are that hold the starter on. The 2 bolts that hold the starter on are this little bell housing looking thing is where the bendix of your starter engages with the engine. And the bolts there's just 2 bolts. They're 14mm bolts. There's one right there, and there's one at the bottom. So when you take those 2 bolts loose, that's going to loosen the starter up. And now that this is loose, you should be able to reach the bottom down here and pull up. And that's going to give just enough room at the bottom to take that starter out from the bottom. May have to hold up on the starter just a little bit to take this one out, because the weight of the starter is going to be pulling on it. Okay, this is going to be difficult to see because everything's up underneath the intake. But these two bolts have been taken out. The starter's loose now, and there's really the only thing connected to the starter is one plug that's pushed into it, and then the line coming from the battery. And so the starter really is loose. If we could pull it far enough out underneath to take those two wires loose, you can remove the whole starter. If you lift up on the intake right here, that's going to give some room. The starter is right there, and it's just a matter of reaching under and getting that starter pulled out. And with this lifted up, there's some hoses and some different things in the way, but you should be able to get the starter out from underneath with a little bit of jockeying. And there it is. And so, I don't know if you can see, but now I've pulled the starter out and I've turned it downward, and now I can access the back of the starter where that plug is, right here. And I'm just going to unplug that plug, and then I can access the nut that's on the back of it. And I should add, and I should have done this at the beginning of the video, you need to disconnect the battery before you start this. So I'm going to stop right here because I forgot to do that. I'm going to disconnect the battery, and then I'm going to finish taking that starter out. All right, I've got the battery disconnected. I pulled the one plug off the starter, and I just have this other plug left on it, or other nut left on it. Okay, so that's a 13 millimeter. And then your starter will come right loose. So okay, just real quickly, I want to show what I was doing. So the starter is in the vehicle like this. We removed the two bolts that came loose here. Then I pulled the starter out, angled it down, and dropped it down like this, where I could access the back of it. Once I had access to the back of the starter, I pulled a plug loose right here, and then took this nut loose right here. This is a 13 millimeter nut. And that allowed the starter to drop down out from underneath the intake. So to put it back on, it's just a matter of sticking it back up in with the Bendix pointed down, connecting those two wires right here, then rotating the starter back up and sliding it in place, and then we'll put the two bolts back in it. So that's going to be the process to put it back in the engine. All right, so that's all there is to it, guys. Once you get that starter back in there and get the wires connected, it's just a reverse process of taking it out, get it put back up in there, and a couple of things. Don't forget to refill your radiator fluid. That's something that might get overlooked. And then just double check and make sure you've reconnected all the vacuum lines and different things that you took loose, and you should be good to go. If this video helped you out, please like, subscribe, add a comment. Have a great day.